If I really hear our saying anything, he wouldn't want us to sit here. He would want us to grab the fishing poles and go start fishing at the baptistry. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you want to catch or not. It's all about the process. Hearing the text that Jeff read for us today brought the memories. I don't know how it just happened, but because of the, I think now with Larissa and her family joining us, we are on the sort of the nostalgic streak. So it brought the memories of my of the first communion I experienced in my hometown of Odessa. Please notice that I did not say my first communion, but I said the first communion I experienced. I might have mentioned it to you in the prior years, but today just particularly fitting because the text in the thoughts and everything that comes to that really highlights the point of what became my personal part of my life, in my spiritual journey. When I walked that day into the church, it's only been maybe third or fourth week I was coming to the Seventh-day Adventist church. And when I first walked in there, I noticed the table in front had a white heel on top of it. And I didn't know what it was, and it looked really strange, but everyone was tiptoeing in the church. You could feel there's particular more somber feel to it. And people were just talking half-tone, and children running through the church were running slow motion. No, I'm just kidding. Children are not supposed to run in Ukrainian Seventh-day Adventist church. Everyone was just kind of, you feel the light was a little dimmer, almost. I asked what's happening, and they whispered, they said, oh, it's communion. I didn't know what communion was. I thought, well, it might be interesting. The word communion to a person who comes from a Russian Orthodox background, it's always something that really has this, for lack of a better term, it's really event that designed to make you feel really, really in the sort of this minor key, very somber. And that was the same atmosphere at the church. So I was decided to stay, and we were singing. Singing was particularly quieter, as I said, all of the hymns in the minor key, and a lot of songs were focused on the death of Jesus and the blood, and everything was just really building out to this moment. And then there was foot washing. Please remember, this was really, really the first time encountering this, and the idea that I would have to take my shoes off and somebody's going to touch my feet was not really comforting. Not to mention, I started thinking, like, if I have holes in my socks. Remember, it was 90s. I only had like maybe a couple pairs of socks. And I was like, are my socks okay? Let's not go further down, but you can think how other things can be a little bit more personal that come to mind. And I said, am I ready? Somebody tapped me in the shoulder and said, let's do it. And after we finished, it was truly amazing experience. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I felt that now I've done something that makes me a different type of a human being. So I was ready for the next part. And the next part happened rather shortly. In just a couple of songs, a little bit of preaching. When I said a little bit of preaching in Ukrainian, it means about 45-minute introductory word. And finally, I'm looking at the clock, it's around like 12:30. You know what happens at 12:30 when you start seeing and smelling communion bread? Everybody's starving. So you're taking it not only because you want it, because you're a little bit of hunger too. So I just couldn't wait for it. And between the hunger and the desires, and the communion bread was very cautiously carried. And at that time, and I don't know my Ukrainian family, do you remember we used to have one cup? It wasn't like little tiny. One cup, and a deacon with the towel wipes after each person. That's You show it to someone in the 2020, they would die from a heart attack just watching this. So this is how it was. And that cup was just in front of me. And the light was hitting, and this red grape juice is just playing there. And the red juice is not something you go and buy in the store. No, the grape juice for communion, someone would collect the grapes. A farmer would collect the grapes and make the juice for communion. It was homemade grape juice that someone would prayed over the grapes and prayed over the juice before the communion. So it was really, really special. And I come, and everybody's standing, waiting. So you stand and waiting until it comes to, then you take the piece and you sit down. So I was standing, waiting. And when the moment it was in front of me, I reached my hands to accept it, and the deacon looked at me and said, "Sit down." I said, "What?" I said, "Sit down, not for you." My knees buckled, not because I wanted to sit down, because I was just a little puzzled. Why? I got a very sympathetic look. Can you get from whom? Can you imagine who would look very sympathetically at me? Can you guess? Children. Because they knew exactly how I felt, because it was me. I was 17 at the time. It was me and the children, the only ones sitting down. Talking about be like little children, I felt at least I fulfilled Jesus' directive there, because I was like a little child, and they looked at me like, "Sorry, buddy, we're in the same boat." And I even tried to tell something, deacon, that I already washed my feet, maybe that would qualify for something, and it didn't. So the communion passed by. I couldn't say that my feelings were hurt, but something inside of me just made it say, I made sure that day that next time the communion comes around, I would do whatever it takes to be qualified to do it, to accept it. And interesting that not giving it made me wanted it even more. But that's not a good motivation. When I ask why would you do something like this? The explanation I was given, I'm still thinking over these years, but it kind of makes sense, because in a time when the church tried to survive during the communist regime, to make this distinction between those who are in and those who are out was very, very important. Make it very, very clear. And to keep that line was important, who is in and who is not. And that was one of the ways the church, it was a survival mechanism to keep the purity of the church. Not to mention, Larissa mentioned last week, the KGB tried to infiltrate the church all the time. And the issue of, are you really part of this? And it goes all the way back to the origin of the Christian church, when taking the communion was really a public statement of baptism, and a communion that was basically a reminder of that was a public statement of your faith, which was really life-threatening statement in the Roman Empire that, let's just say, it did not have a very favorable view of Christians. So that cost you life to just accept the communion. So all of that kind of making a sense, but it brings me back to our text today, because as we read and understand what's happening, we now see that the situation in Galatia has to do with this issue of who is in and who is out. The situation in Galatia reminds us that from the very beginning of the church, it was important for everyone to distinguish what is happening. So, Paul travels through Asia Minor. This is the territory of Turkey, if you will, roughly. And he goes to, in the city of Antioch, it's where the events are starting to happen. The Antioch has a very special meaning to Paul. Paul is set to convert Gentiles. It's a radical mission. I think it's hard for us to understand what it's almost no different than if somebody would try to go today in the Middle East and try to, or go to Muslim countries and try to do the work there among the radical Muslims. People who have the faith, they're so out there, they're so different from us. So the question of identity in the first century Israel was very, very important. Who's insider and who's the outsider? And more Gentiles, not native Jews, began showing interest in the church. They started to be interested in Judaism even before Christianity. And there were three groups of people. They were divided on proselytes, resident aliens, and God-fearers. Those are three groups of people that would start attending a Jewish gathering, a Jewish synagogue. And the proselytes were those who would go all the way and accept Judaism. And for us, it's especially in America, when we are a big melting pot, it's hard to imagine this distinction. But being a Jewish ethnically and being a Jewish in terms of your religion and faith was the same thing. It wasn't a separate thing. So you can't just accept Judaic faith and remain not being Jewish. Hence, you had to be circumcised. So proselytes were those who would accept and literally become Jewish. That would, if somebody asked them, what's your nationality, instead of writing Greek or whatever, the Roman, or they would write Jewish, because they now being converted in Judaism, meaning to change your very identity, very being of who you are. And this is what they believed was so important. Those are proselytes. But the resident aliens and God sympathizers, they were just kind of looking at it from the distance. They were not quite in. The reason it was so important for Jews to distinguish that, because they believed in something that was that one of the theologians, E.P. Sanders, called covenantal nomism. They believed that God will only save Jews. God will only save Jews. It doesn't mean necessarily ethnically you have a chance to convert, but God would only, you're not saved by your works. This is very clear. We sometimes think with legalism and so forth. No, you're not saved by your works, but you can only be saved if your identity is 100% through and through Jewish. And how do you know that your identity 100% through and through Jewish? You need to be doing things that Jewish people do. And of course, you start with circumcision, and you develop the practices that would clearly distinguish your lifestyle from everybody else's. So God, according to Jewish tradition, was only interested in Jews. I could just, this word tradition is so important to understand everything Judaism. By the way, Jeff, if I'm saying wrong, it's Shana Tova. Did I say it right? And what does it mean? Good year. It's actually Jewish New Year's Day today. So Happy New Year, everyone. Or you can say it with me. Let's do it. You learn one Jewish phrase today. Say it, Jeff, maybe you can say it better than I do. Shana Tova, is that good enough? Shana Tova, can we say it together? 1, 2, 3. Shana Tova. So if you have any Jewish friends, you can call them and wish them Happy New Year. It's actually, in Jewish tradition, you don't really wish Happy New Year. Jewish people cannot be happy. No, I'm just kidding. I'm married to a Jewish person, so I know what I'm talking. No, I'm just kidding again. Shana Tova, it's basically say, hey, may the next year be good. Not great, it's just good. Good is good. And the idea is that what's happening between New Year or and the next holiday, which is Yom Kippur, it's about 1 week in between. So on the New Year, you sort of submit the records of your life to God. And on Yom Kippur, or it's a day of atonement, those records are being recorded and sealed. So on the Yom Kippur, and we'll get to it in a second, your greeting would be, may the records. So first you say, may it be good year, may your record be good. And then, may your good record be sealed by God. So in other words, God will write your life in. So Jewish tradition, and I can just, this word, I know Sometimes my children make fun of me when I make cultural references that I assume everybody knows, but not everyone, not every generation. But how many of you have never heard of Fiddler on the Roof? All right, yeah, right. So Fiddler on the Roof, it's the whole idea of the Jewish tradition and how much it impacts and shapes the lives of Jewish community. And it begins with this message of tradition and how much it matters. Well, tradition, as you can see, it's not just the idea or people like to tell around. Tradition in the Jewish mindset meant literally salvation. If you don't keep your tradition, it means your future life, your eternal life is really in jeopardy. So tradition is everything. So to be Jewish is to follow the tradition. It even goes this far that the whole idea of the sinner, when we understand sin, it's someone who rebels against God or trespasses or breaks the commandments. This is the idea of sinner. Not so in the Jewish understanding in the first century. And this is the mindset we have to understand. In their mind, sinner was not necessarily a person who sins against God. Sinner was the person who does not follow the tradition. That was the sinner. So anyone who is not doing Jewish thing is a sinner, so every Gentile is automatically, right? Not every sinner is Gentile, but every Gentile is a sinner. So if you are outside, you're automatically a sinner. So this is why when we start saying, oh, Paul kind of went and he wanted to preach to Gentiles, we read this 21 centuries later and we sort of, well, that's kind of tough and difficult, but we don't understand that the whole radical thing of Paul, he's trying to turn everything upside down. The following tradition is so deep, is so much identity. It's not only an idea of something you feel nice about. The greatest war, one of the greatest wars in the history of Judaism was Maccabean War. And Maccabean War is a revolt of Jewish people against Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Am I messing around? Antiochus Epiphanes, who wanted to make sure that he didn't only defeat the Jews. When he occupied in the 2nd century BC, when he occupied Jerusalem, what he did, he brought a pig into the temple, would defile the temple. And that created such a revolt. And one of the things, and what caused the whole war, that one of the Jewish people was forced to touch the pork, to touch the dead pig. And not only to touch the pig was a already major abomination. To touch a dead corpse was even worse. So the whole thing started the war, and for them the idea of dietary laws, of following the purity laws, it was so much in the sort of the fabric, in the identity. People were willing, people gave up their lives, they sacrificed their families, they sacrificed everything to keep the tradition pure. So when we say, like, why couldn't they just compromise a little bit? No, it goes deep inside. So when we look at the differences and we find ourselves in a world that is very divided today, and we want to say in sort of a naive way to repeat the phrase of why can't we just get along? Why don't we just love one another? We don't understand that sometimes what seems to us just the trivial differences, the difference of opinion, goes deep inside and cuts into the very identity of what we stand for. And we cannot simply dismiss and say, why don't you stop thinking the way you're thinking? Or why don't you allow me to contribute to what you're thinking? That is not as simple as this. When people have the preconceived ideas, they're often connected in the very nature of who they are. And we have to be very, very careful when we approach that, because sometimes because of our own ignorance, we can dismiss something or oversee something that is very important. So in this conversation between Paul and other apostles, this conversation to come to its climax in Galatians, we see two sides. On one side, we have the Christians who were led by James, who was the first leader or the bishop, if you will, of believers in Jerusalem. And we can understand that Christians did not get a good reputation. And they were persecuted. And when the Jews were not kind of pushed by Romans, the first people that would give out was a Christian who said, we don't even know who these are. And that kind of explains even what happened to Christ. Because as soon as Christ stepped back and said, your tradition is not guarantees your salvation. You're not saved because you're a Jew. You're not saved because of the temple. You're not saved because you're bringing sacrifice. There's something more to it. And they ask a question, what can be more to that? What can be more to that? Our fathers, our grandfathers died for this. And you're telling me this is nothing? And Jesus says, no. I'm not saying it's nothing. I did not to eliminate that. I'm just telling you there's more. And what's more, you're looking at Him. For Jews, it was a radical idea. It was so hard to comprehend. But for Jews in Jerusalem, it was still possible because most of the Christians in Jerusalem were Jewish in their nationality. So they were able to blend in. And in order for Christianity to survive, the church leaders make a decision. Why don't we just don't rock the boat too much? Why don't we just keep it to us, what we believe, and we maintain this bridge, and we'll try this dance that we can try to keep the relationship and not stick too much, because if we show how different we are from Jews, it will definitely kill the church and kill it quickly. Let's just keep it down, keep it quiet. Paul, on the other hand, is very different. He takes off like a man, and he goes through the territory of Turkey. He would go all the way to now territory of Italy, and he wants to reach and he wants to preach. And guess what's happening as soon as you get outside of Jerusalem, on the periphery? First of all, there are very strong Jewish diaspora everywhere. There were Jewish communities in all the cities that Paul would go to. But alongside, there were all those who proselytes and resident aliens and God-fearers, those people who were interested in Jerusalem, and they started listening to Paul, and they say, oh, this gives us hope, because that's something that we don't have to try hard. You're telling me I don't have to become a Jew in order to be saved? Tell me more about it. I want to hear more, because that gives a totally different way of hearing and understanding. There is more to it than just God who is concerned, particularly one small nation. Peter and Barnabas agree with Paul. And they come and they make this agreement and say, okay, it looks like it's not necessary to be circumcised. This is what is known as the first council in Jerusalem. This is when the apostles came back and say, do we believe just Christ? Forget the Judaism. Hold on for Judaism. Do we believe that did Christ come to save all? Or did Christ come to save only Jews? And it was clear that Christ came to save all. So we should not require people to be circumcised to become members of our community, to become Christians. To be a Christian did not require to be circumcised anymore. And the Timothy says, great, I don't have to, and poor Titus has to be circumcised. So go figure that one out. So it's never clear cut in the Christian church, but the overall, the movement, sort of the arc of the Christianity start bending toward grace and acceptance and embracing and understanding the views that are very radically different. This is what we need to grasp, that Christianity came not to kind of connect what is already together. Christianity came to subvert the diversity. Christianity came to subvert the separation. Christianity came to bring people who are extremely different in their opinions, to bring them together. That's the essence, that's the whole goal of Christianity, if you will, to bring it together. So Paul, who is introduced to church by Barnabas, Paul, who shares with Peter same ideas, he goes with that, and he establishes the church in Antioch on his first missionary trip. And in Antioch, it's sort of for some people would say that arguably Antioch became the cradle of Christianity, because Antioch is where the Christianity starts shaping not only as a Jewish sect, but truly a worldwide religion, faith that based on the Judaic principles, but it's a lot more. So Christianity kind of starts with Antioch and moves. So the churches in Galatia, they take Antioch as a sort of a mothership. That's where it all started. That's where it all comes. So what happens in Antioch, in the events of today's text deals with, is what might be called Antioch incident. What happened is Paul started going with this radical idea. And remember, the tradition is everything. And they already sort of became a little lenient on the whole circumcision thing. But Paul does something more. What James and other brethren in Jerusalem hear, and can you imagine? Paul sits down and eats with the same table with the Gentiles. What on earth is Paul doing? James is now mad on two levels. First of all, he already knows what the Jewish elders are going to say. He already knows that the leaders of the culture are going to say. Paul just erased the legacy all the way from Exodus to Maccabees. It means we don't stand for anything. And a second, and James remembers that the person, but not the apostle, but the same name, was just decapitated a couple years prior to that, just for precisely that thing, for talking and preaching Christianity. He wants to keep the church. He wants to save the church. He's acting very pastorally. Do we have to do this? Why can't we keep the Gentiles at Gentile table and Jews at the Jewish table? Why can't we do that? And pastorally, it feels, this is sort of the common sense. This is what we should do, right? Let's just keep conservatives and liberals separate. Let's just keep the Democrats and the Republicans. Just keep it separate. Let's just not to mention it. Let's just not do that. Not at the church. Because it stirs up, makes us feel uncomfortable. I can understand James, and I can sympathize, because James is wise, and James is thinking pastorally. And he reaches out to Peter. Peter says, I suppose you're right, because my mission is to convert Jews. And how I can now go to Jewish community and tell them that they need to accept the Christ, because they point me and Paul and say, Christ, really? See what your Paul is doing. He's making us to sit down at the same table with the sinners. Because remember, not every sinner is a Gentile, but every Gentile is a sinner. He makes us sit down with the sinners at the same table. Can't do that. And Peter thinks that's going to really affect my mission. Because I'm supposed to convert Jews. They're going to stop listening to me, so I have no choice but disassociate myself with Paul and say, Paul is really cuckoo. He doesn't even know what he's doing. I think we should just stay with the old rule. You become a Jew first and a Christian next. And Barnabas is not really an upfront person. When I think of Barnabas, I think of Chuck for some reason. I don't know why. Just this solid dude just keeps it all together with the utmost love and grace. And the church is sitting not on the people who are up front, but Barnabas, who does all this background work. He doesn't even care to be in front. When he needs to be in front, he's in front and bold. Even Barnabas thinking, I suppose, maybe not now. And when Paul hears this, how they say it in English, he blows a fuse. Is that what the appropriate thing? I mean, a vein pops out. He's livid, upset. And you can see he uses the language when he writes to Galatians. He begins, by the way, if you're a pastor and you want to write to your church, and this is the church you no longer to be pastor of, how do you begin your letter? You foolish Galatians, you morons, what are you doing? You can tell you where Paul is at. He is not practicing emotional intelligence right now, I'm telling you. He goes all out because he is so personally upset. He felt personally betrayed. Peter and Barnabas is the one who led him by the hand into the church. He said, this is the person who's going to change the way we think. This is the person who's going to change our mission. This is Paul. And Paul feels that this is my people. And what am I hearing they're doing? We disassociate ourselves with Gentiles. We associate ourselves with those who don't think like us. And he writes this letter to Galatians. And he's making this point. And you can think, oh, Paul, he's just getting so mad and he's so upset. We just need to make sure that he understands what's important there. But for Paul, it's not just the issue of a personal preference. It's very important not to miss this, because I've been through a lot of theological debates in church and outside one church. And I go to conventions and the theologians going at it. And I've been through a lot. And let's just face it, there's a lot of ego involved. If somebody spent 20 years studying something, don't tell that person she's wrong. If somebody just defended his doctoral dissertation, don't tell that person that that's just basically a bunch of gibberish. So much life, so much been sacrificed. The children grew up orphans because dad decides to do PhD. And sometimes people defend their point of view based on this personal involvement. But this is not the case with Paul. This is very important to understand. This is not his personal opinion of feeling or having his feelings hurt. For him, it's a deeply theological issue. And the concept that he brings here, he brings it in this letter, and he wants to explain. And he wants to open it up, and he wants to say, and make it very, very clear that if we have a chance of being called followers of Jesus, there cannot be separation on us and them, on insiders and outsiders. No matter what people do, no matter where they come from, no matter what they practice. You know, it kind of reminds me when we came to America in 1996, in Texas, there were still restaurants. I think I shared with you, when they still have restaurants, when you walk in, they ask you a question. Huh? Now, first question. Oh, no, see, now you brought the new ones. So this is the first century here to go. Yeah. No, so first of all, they ask how many, which is always my favorite question. And the second question, smoking or not smoking. We were first in California. It was not a question here. We spent a month and a half. But when we went to Texas, we walked in and it was like, smoking and non-smoking. Yeah, but comes an outsider, as alien as you can get. We're standing there. I'm looking one restaurant, one building, an aisle, maybe 8 feet, 10 feet. And on one side, there are people drinking water with lemon. On the other side, people are drinking. Let's not focus on what they're drinking. So, with a cigarette. I will never forget, right behind us, a gentleman walks in, of course, Texas hat, and a cigar hanging off his mouth. And the young hostess, she looks at him, grabs the menu and says, smoking and not smoking. She probably memorized the lunch, just does it automatically. And he looks at her and says, well, are you serious? So, This is the church. Now you have to walk in and divide it Jewish or non-Jewish. One restaurant, separate tables in one place. Paul saying, do you understand that it means when Christ sat at the table to share the communion, we should have divided the table. Oh, well, they're all Jews there. Probably there was no need. But it means there is a separate table. It means when you break the bread and when you pass the cup. And what Paul is hearing, the same thing I'm hearing in the Gentile walking into the Christian church in the first century. I heard during my first communion experience, not for you. We have something for you, but not this. This is for a separate group of people who are somehow better and different. What Paul is having issue is that it's not about our cultural preferences, but us being divided makes a statement about God who takes a human position on the human issues. This is a very dangerous God, because under the name of that God, the worst wars happen in the entire human history. You know, they're religious God wars. They're not led by God in whom we believe. They're led by God who has the same enemies we do. This is where Paul is finding this very dangerous. This is not the tradition. Jay Neusner, when he looked at the practices, he's one of the theologians, he looked at the practices. I think there was total like 314 or 341, I think, laws, 280 plus of them, 287, like 67% of the laws that make you Jewish would have to do with the dietary procedures. What you cook with like you're not supposed, try to serve goat cooked in milk to Jeff. He's never going to eat it. Or maybe you will. You like curry? I know Jeff likes curry. But you cannot cook certain things with certain things. You cannot mix things. Of course, you cannot eat. Even today, I told you the story that I found out yesterday. I didn't know it was the case. Apparently, it's illegal to grow pigs in Israel. Have you heard of it? You know it's illegal. Do you know that there are pig farms in Israel? Carter, here's the puzzle for you. You like puzzles. How is it when it's illegal to grow a pig in Israel, you can own a pig farm? You know what's illegal in Israel? For a pig to touch the holy ground. How can you have a pig farm? All the pig farms in Israel have raised floors. The pigs don't never touch the ground. Then it makes it legal. How's that for following traditions? So you start making these things. But imagine 67% of what makes you Jew and gives you an identity is how you approach the table. So people start controlling the table. And Paul is where he's finding the issue. He said, do you understand that if Christianity is about the table, it's about this morsel that reminds me of the body of Jesus, and this cup that is we call cup of salvation and the bread of life. And this is now controlled not by the one whose blood it is and whose body it is. It is controlled by people who decide who gets to the table. And this is where he's giving the process. It's not about his ego. It's about this fundamental issue to understand who God is and how we view our church. We cannot have separate tables under the same roof. Because the church is only the church when there is only one table. Big enough for everyone. No matter what you've done in your life, no matter where you come from, no matter where you're at right now, no one can tell you you're not allowed to the table. And if you say that the mission of Christianity becomes, if anything, is that message, and this is what the gospel is, This is God. We're in the series of God rebuilds and redeems. This is the God's rebuilding and redeeming this world. And Paul feels that this is call of his entire life, that he's going to go to everyone he can possibly go and to say, please come with me to the table. And you don't have to ask which side. You don't have to ask even which table, because there is only one. And only one who allows access or denies the access to the table is only one whose body and whose blood is on it. That's what makes Christianity different. Paul argues in Galatians, not because he likes things in a certain way, but he doesn't understand. He doesn't see the way for church to be the church without changing the metaphor. And then the religion that start moving, they know the temple will be destroyed. The temple has lost its integrity in a sense. And the religion and the faith is moved from the temple to the table. But this is not an exclusive table. It is table, this is a buffet that opened for everyone. And there is plenty for everyone, and no one can say, you are not allowed and you're not, until you become the way I think you should behave. The grace of God is when we realize that no one can claim a controlled access to the table. I grew up in a city where was really cosmopolitan, and before the Russian Revolution, the second largest population, second most spoken language was Hebrew. Oh, I should say probably Yiddish. Jews were the second largest population in my hometown. Greeks, Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Bulgarians, Turks, Greeks, all kinds of people. And everyone was bringing to the table what they do the best, their best food, their best songs, their best dances. And this is the culture that Paul very much is living. This is the city of Antioch in which it's all happening. We live, I think, today more in Antioch than we live in Jerusalem. And today, when we see people looking at us, we need to decide what kind of message that we want to send out. Do we want to say, stop and sit down, not for you, or we want to open the table? Paul writes to Galatians with only one and only one purpose. We need to hear that when we start separating, we start controlling access to the table, it changes our identity. It changes who we are. Do we want to be the people who welcome everyone, or we want to stay with the message of the past? Are we going to be the people of the future or the people of the past? And this is important because it can only get into even the everyday practices, the way we perceive things, the comments we make, especially now when it's going to get increasingly politically. I mean, you can't imagine it's going to get worse than it is now. Probably it will before November. What if our message today? I think our message today is the same that Paul leaves and proclaims. We all are at the same table. There's no separate things here. I have this crazy dream. It doesn't make any sense. But that idea come to mind somehow, that I'm dreaming that I have enough money. I would like to open a restaurant. And the restaurant would only have one table. And all the food would be free. I don't think I'll make it rich in this kind of restaurant, but I have the name for it. I would call it Antioch. I would probably go broke. There's no way such an enterprise can survive unless there's somebody crazy in another town, let's say Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or Odessa, Riverside, Loma Linda, would hear about a restaurant like this and would want to open one too. And then another one, and another one. And even though we were not going to be making money, somehow we would keep the most important thing about the restaurant. We will have people fed. And maybe this is the miracle of Christianity. This is why Paul can write this in the letter to Galatians. It is not longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. In a life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And in chapter 3, verse 26 and down. For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. Remember, who looks at you sympathetically at the communion, you're not allowed. Children. As many of you are baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself with Christ. There's no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There's no longer Democrat or Republican. No, I'm just making it up. There's no longer male or female. All of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs to the promise. How would you call your restaurant? If you were get to have enough money to set up your own place, a coffee shop, a barbecue, kosher, vegan, Indian, Chinese, Mexican, how would you name this restaurant? How would you set it up? And it almost doesn't matter what kind of food you would serve, as long as you would have only one table. And then we find ourselves at one table. And when that happens, we'll find ourselves embodying the message of Galatians. Galatians is no longer letters, no longer ink on the page, but the blood in the lives of those who call themselves Christians, all sitting at one table called grace. May this be our record. Gemar Katima Tavar, which means Gemar Katima Tavar. May your record